The devil religion requires the manipulation of the normal humans, who would then, receiving the participation of their portion of sin, can be condemned under the capture, and thus, if committing the sins under the specific series of failures in the specific categories at the correct times, under the exact precise circumstances, then the devil worshipping religion function might facilitate how the party is to be divided in the payment of their sins, and thus provides the services of the demon or devil in question who would be taking control of it. Now, to the extent that the demons, under their theory, are pure chaos and devils are lawful evil, then the arrangement of increasing in the luxuries or amenities derivative requires the function of the ability to have earned it by the services, increasing the likelihood of the deals with the devils as opposed to the deals with the demons, who would, by definition, being too chaotic in nature to functionally generate any permanent profit sets, would generate for themselves permanent inferiority and compel consumption for the acceleration of outright power as opposed to the function of the division of wealth, as the function of chaos derives the influx. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, being derivative of the idea of the demonic, facilitates the hypercentralizing of power to themselves in the absorption, as opposed to the devil, who divides the wealth for the persistent stabilizing of the social mechanisms for its particular luxuries, allowing it to delegate the advantages, at which points the demons can be dealt with arbitrarily. And to this extent, the generating of the systems of wealth in these permanent systems of companies generates the normalization function to being able to contract portions of these wealths in deals with the devil, which generates ways for stumbling blocks against the general human populations to be absorbed underneath them, building their slavery functions, which then stabilizes their permanent returns with the support structure of the compelled service. And to this extent, the sales and distribution of the abuses deliberates the specific profit intake, as the ability to sell the abuse generates the money. And to the worshippers of the devil religion in this world, they systemically approve of the same function, as it is a function of eternity. And to that extent, those who commit the sins simply are going to be dividing their souls in the infinite variation, giving their negative karma the specific contracts, aligning them to their fates for the punishments specific to them and their offenses by the karmic stream, leading to systems of stumbling blocks, which creates exceptions, which creates variations, which creates difficulties for them to engage in the larger scam. And thus the mechanism requires them to engage in extreme precision, and those that they hold as a sacrifice, they are not taking a portion for, as the mechanism of that sacrifice is a cost of business for the larger influx of profits, and thus they lose the profits from the one in order to gain the profits for the larger scheme, as forfeiting the advantages at cost of business. Unless, of course, they engage in the function, such as derivative in some theologies, uh, such as in the Hindu religion, where the position of time dilation generates the capability of the heavens to be able to engage in being hyper fast in relation to the earth, and that the hells are hyper slow in proportion to the earth, and thus you might spend 2,000 years within 5 minutes in hell, whereas you can spend a year, which becomes hundreds of years, in heaven. And thus, in this mechanism of heaven, the gods generate negative karma by the defects which they've normalized. And thus, even the gods would recycle and go into hell on the basis of having committed those offenses, generating their restrictions to the specific karmic waves. And to this extent, the true function of escaping into nirvana is the only mechanism. The act of ceasing to exist is the only way for them to functionally escape the horrors designed for them, according to the whirlpool sucking them into the hells. And to that extent, the function of the fallen angels, including their contracts with the devils, seeking the advantage, might take someone who is otherwise holy and might raise themselves potentially to the position of this nirvana and compel them to engage in the luxuries of the gods, which has normalized it and isn't specifically telling them. While they do have to have the negative consequences derivative of negative intention, they have to know that something is wrong and for it to be viewed as normal for them to accept the normality of its use, defecting into the functional sin, which allows the service to the fallen angels the capacity to hyperaccelerate the party's skipping of the entry into the heavens by the virtue of being their servant and partaking in the offenses to make them descend into the hells where they would be managed by those devils in an elaborate scheme where the one who plays all parts is tricking himself in order to engage in the function of their nefarious narratives. Now, because this would generate those negative karmic positions from someone who does not have the godly karma, they have been undermined and they go straight from having served the gods and then back to Earth under the exponential advanced times in order for them to die eventually and then to go to hell for having consumed the negative karma of the gods. Which means, by definition, they went from servant of the gods to slave of hell, and they, having skipped entirely the process of becoming gods themselves, and thus the mechanism of fooling the participant from fully ascending into themselves as a mechanism similar to an old boys club, where the objective is to keep out anyone who is not specifically welcome, requiring a front of absolute jovial participation. And while the acceptance of the luxuries of that servant has to be done in good faith and hyper validating the party, it is merely a con in order to prevent them from participating as a god himself, and thus permanently banning him outside of the extraordinary cycle, derivative of the exponential periods of time that the gods go through these cycles, and thus pushing them out entire epochs from being able to enter what would have immediately been to their advantage had they died without having been taken. Although this negative karma requires the offense to have been intentional. and thus the mechanism of it being intentional as a violation or a defect of a possibility that they could have not done the negative karma relents them from the negative karma, or is provided an alternative, and thus they would be welcomed to consume the negative karma, whereas the possibility of avoiding the negative karma is necessary, as the function in that cycle of karmic retribution requires the parties to not have the functional entrapment schemes where the parties are framed or given misrepresented positions, lest the functional system break down in its entirety and degrade permanently into a system of undermining each other in perfect anarchy, which would, of course, construct consistent layers of illusions in order to defraud those who are of a lower occult knowledge so that they might be self delusional into the desirable traps profiting the devil's corporations. And thus, unlike with the FBI in the United States, which are actively framing people, this would actively degrade until it becomes its own nonsense, which would reset an entire cycle, as it is itself its own negative karmic arrangement, which would delegate its subordinates to the devil's corporations. To this extent, the mechanism of it having compelled itself into a form of order in order for it to have existed in the first place, requires the activity of the possibility of escape, as the alternative is simply slave ratings with fraud, which would hyper-accelerate negative karmas, and thus the action becomes self-delusional, for the structure of the devils in the hierarchy would seek to create that as its preferred mechanism for the higher influx of slaves. And to the extent that they engage in the negative karma of these hate crime functions, you engage in the function of the perfection, and thus the mistreatment of the targets by the abuses requires the party to have been innocent in that arrangement for the devils to have received the slaves from the enforcement mechanism, and thus the slave raiders, having made the deal with the devil for the advantage to make the abuses in the black market, has to have created the perfect mechanism in the black market for them to have collected the negative karmas, tugging them and pulling them under the chains of their contracts to their devils who will consume their souls for their luxury. And this, of course, is the reason why those who worship the devil religion cannot be allowed to lie about the thing, and the action of them having to tell the truth is their escape from that negative karmic cycle. But if they are doing that contract in order to gain the benefit from the black market, they are consuming the negative karma, such as the obligation of the exchange of services. Now, if they lie so that they do not have to conduct the exchange of services, then by definition they have collapsed into that position and have entrapped themselves into the very system they sought to escape by telling the truth, generating the function of them changing the specific departments of their failure and their obligations and their specific devil overlords on the basis of this change, which seems primarily arbitrary to those who do not understand the high complications of the algorithms being used, similar to the function of tides in the river, which engage from the rapid to push someone. Now, the person has very little control over where they are taken in the current, and where they're put off seems particularly arbitrary and ununiform. But I assure you, by definition, it does have a system of its own logics, although they are immensely complicated, but those complications, having been thoroughly understood by those who have had the eternity to have studied it, have made for themselves preferred corporations in the study of the karmic river. As it is said one time, people say it. I said it once. The advantage of power is far more systematically intoxicating and prone towards problems than the function of poverty, although it is necessary for the existence of society for it to have been structured, and thus it is easier to trust someone who's gone through extreme hardship over the provision of, uh, or rather, the trusting of someone of great power requires the active demonstration of trustworthiness, which is extraordinarily difficult. Similar to the function of when they targeted David, um, and I'm speaking as one of the characters supporting the Confederacy on this specific reference, the representation of one of their characters, um, that they believe in the function that David, having been superior to them, would have had to have proven his loyalty to the United States because of the nature of his superior power, makes them feel fundamentally uneasy, even the legitimate ones who belong in the government. And thus, the function of him being the aristocracy requires them to have filtered it, and thus they make various claims and distractions, and the good faith one requires David to have acquired some kind of being devoted to the military, to have proven his loyalty, and that he would not betray it, and thus that mechanism on the acknowledgement of his power that they don't want to publish because it inherently triggers these series of logical strings, materializes the function of him as intelligence oversight, where he has to be acknowledged according to his status and has to be provided the opportunities specifically attuned towards his superiority, and thus the reflecting status of him being the top rank general of the intelligence oversight is essential as a mechanism to that. And to the extent that they are doing this, they are seeking to play that same trick that was explained about the gods in the negative karma. But the function has systematically been underinvested into in order to have it been prevented from it actually succeeding, as the mechanism required the functional acknowledgement for the ascension, whereas its connection according to the surveillance interlog under the fraud simply adds additional negative karmas to them from their digestion of the negative fruits, and to this extent has blown up in their face according to this religious activity. And to this extent, the mechanism requires them to have made the higher investment into the material viability, uh, as the gods, not having a choice in that example, had to take the human to the realm of the gods to travel through time in the heavens. And to that end, the mechanism has to be the same. Uh, in order for that trick to work, then they would have had to have forced the mechanism of David's entry into the status which they are trying to deny under the other mechanisms for the extortion. And it having failed because of their non-alignment with their legal obligations to that contract, according to the cosmic rivers, it deposits him into a non-profitable part of the river by the current. and to this extent they would have to start all over again for their objective to have been satisfied. Doing it correctly as the function of making the sacrifice uh, from the removing of the capacity to survive at his legal status is systemically subversive to their capability, generating a starvation sacrifice or murder by ritual sacrifice is the function of the adjustment of the negative karma, which exponentially puts them hyper under the debts, and to this extent becomes super inferior from them falling into their own traps of negative karma, which includes but is not limited to them trying to convey their poisoned scripts by being calm and not breaking character, as opposed to the function of them participating in the actual capability of succeeding, as their underinvestment has systemically collapsed their progress according to these ritual behaviors, which is getting altogether too difficult to escape, as its gravitational pull is not decreasing, but they are gaining in momentum. In the words of Jesus, which I'm probably going to butcher and don't get as a direct quote, but it is easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven, is based on these functional disadvantages hyper compounded by opportunity, and the opportunity generates obligation, and the obligation generates duty, and the duty generates consistency, and thus the mechanism of their hyperconsistency makes it exponentially more difficult on the managing of the structure for the higher chastity demanded of those, similar to the function of those who are ordered to not want to become preachers or leaders, as they will require, or it will be required of them, that they will have a higher judgment, that they will be judged according to a more strict guideline. And while the graces of God will be provided, and that the poor will have been hyper-accelerated, the opportunities of the exponentially more generated by the powerful and the rich is possible under their higher discipline specifically designed for this, and thus the rewards derived by the white throne judgment, where everything that is done in malice or for individual gain will be consumed, and the person will enter heaven as though through fire, is generated to the position whereas the person would have generated their own wealth and status and position and nobility by these demonstrations of power, which is then bypassed by it being stolen, where it is then automated by the grace of God in order to have made the party who has been robbed from that position inherently superior under that arrangement, having been given the grace of God in the having been restrained from the higher position provided by nature for their place in humanity to have designed the more strict judgment, which is automatically defected and given to them by the graces. And to this extent, this is one of the theologies generated by the devil religion on how they were going to bypass certain karmic negativities, as the hyper acceleration of the acknowledgement of the thing would have materialized itself as a natural consequences in the reaction outside of their negative behavior, which has redirected it away from their desired outcome as far as that is concerned. To this extent, the mechanism of that being preserved requires the attunement to those activities on their part to the material world outside of that ethereal theory as its own state. And while it functionally would be true for their targets, it would not be true that they would require uh, or receive the benefit from that arrangement, as the grace of God has nothing to do with them, and they would be deposited in a negative aspect from the reverse current. As a drowned party who is, from their position of wealth and status and position, less likely to have received the graces of being able to enter into any beneficial pact, and thus compelled into the whirlpool where they are drowned with the devils, where they are subject to its incorporation. And the fall being exponentially more than they would consider is sold to them as one step below, which is simply uh, at most considered as a large uh, stone staircase on a mountain, considered to be something like 3 feet at the most, usually, and the activity of it being that consideration is engaged in a spiraling staircase, whereas the way that they're going to fall puts them at the lower staircase, and so the 3 feet, it's the 3 feet by the 15 feet down where it's connected similarly, at which points they're going to receive the falling damage. So in the example where it's 15 staircases down, or 15 steps down, at the 3 feet you have the, what is that, 45 feet? Easily a crushing amount. And it could easily get worse than that, as the function could severely go down to the next step, which would have easily exceeded the 70 feet necessary for the perfect assassination, where someone who drops from it has the perfect amount of force from the fall damage to die without it causing too much of a mess by splattering blood, and thus in that serve the devils who are capturing them exponentially, as they, not having to respect the party who is the recipient in their contracted deal, would be exponentially below the state where they would have had to have been acknowledged in the service, similar to the function where the it was one of the creepypasta type videos where there was someone who went to hell for some arbitrary reason, who's forced to serve Lucifer and Leviathan and the rest of them in their battles of the world under the multiverse from simulations, as they systematically train specific conflicts against the human race time and time and time again, and the party, having received the specific benefits from the currents of the cosmic karmic river, would have had to have been acknowledged in the service at that ranking, and thus the benefits being to that party for those specific series of incalculable variations would have been the thing that they would have received under their original theory, which is easily fraught and lost, as their contracts in the cosmic arrangement is a double-sided blade, and in the function of warfare, which they would have had to have used, the error but a little generates an absolute failure or a fatal devastation, and to this extent they lose all advantages in the hierarchy that they're looking for on that minute inadequacy. And thus the mechanism of these eternal systems of commerce would generate to themselves their own difficulty in the capability of sustaining themselves even a short period of time, which is hyper accelerated, as our short period of time is an eternity to them, and thus the mechanism of what would be perceived as a failure within a couple of weeks would be drawn out for them to be its own eternity, and to this extent becomes exponentially compromised or easily stolen in the systems of anarchy amongst the fascist corporations engaging in their eternal conflicts and competitions over the acquiring, sustaining, and maintaining of each wealth set amongst the arbitrage of absolute chaos, where backstabbing is a way of life, such as the one derived by its control from the systems of law, which hyper validates the function of intrigue, which generates nation humbling mistakes, with the absolute enforcement of law as the person who would be conducting the major injury, hyper accelerating themselves by each advancements by the backstabbing, has to do so in a way where they don't get caught, and thus the mechanism of the protection of secrecy against remedy is a way of life under law system by which they persist and exist and maintain the entirety of their influence from, such as is specifically derived by the origin story of Dris Duerden. Now, the minor splat derivative of the 90-foot drop, where they miss just barely the 70, where there is zero splatter, they have the active painting on the walls by which allows them their artistic flares expressing themselves into the mechanisms of their perfected arts, similar to the function of the drow who would give up power in order for the thing to express itself in the more attractive artistic flair. And to this extent, even that mistake would generate to itself its own series of luxury. And to this end, you have the perpetuation of the remainder of the value from that portion of the company, which is explained more specifically through mechanisms such as in the parasitic corporation function. Um, if you watched, what is it called? How I Met Your Mother, Bernie had engaged in the function of having fired someone or a series of people or departments in order to engage in the company having more additional money because it doesn't have to pay its employees, uh, which generates their ability to take the money off of the top and give themselves a raise. And the function of the devil in that religion generates those raises for himself from these catastrophic failings from its superior hierarchical members who have acquired their position in the cosmic corporation and having failed it generated the additional value which would have had to have been provided to them under the lawful evil mechanism, which is no longer consumed by them by virtue of their failure, which is entirely disconnected from the devil that just let them slip. And then the capability to make all of these illusionary realms under Frazobulu their lord of deception would then consume their souls and provide the additional luxuries and amenities from the service of having sold such a delectable meal to that particular devil, and to the infinite diversities of those illusions by the demon lord generates the capacities for infinite training rackets in the contests and future posturings against his rivals. And he is quite happy with the capability of having compromised the lawful and the good, and thus the mechanisms of having taken over good religious peoples, and the community centers and churches and synagogues and buildings of all forms, centralizing their focus, having been able to corrupt them systemically, such as the infusement of their spirits into the meals, that they might devour the devils and devour the demons for the interest of having incorporated them with the intoxication, similar to the function of Holy Communion, where the communion allows for the digesting of Jesus into the person, that they might receive his body and they might receive his blood. But this being corrupted in the consumption of the subordinate demons generates the capacity of the corruption blood and the corruption flesh, which ingests them into the currents, specifically aligning them, that the demonic might accelerate in the system, having provided the more delicate dainties for the dessert dissenter, which might devour delicious devastation upon the formerly opposite, made specifically tailored to its most specific taste. There was once a story I heard where a person went to hell and saw many people, including people who were once Christians and have labeled themselves as such, and having pleaded to God that they were Christians and they've gone to church their entire lives and that they belonged with them. And they called one of the people Emily or something, yeah? But she's gone through her entire life worshiping God and going to church and trying to be a good, moral Christian person. And Jesus Christ, in their example, refused her, saying that she cannot be rescued because he doesn't know who she is. She's completely rejected God and has accepted the Balaam sacrifice function, where those coming from Israel to conquer Canaan had received a prophet from God of the kingdoms of Canaan. And the king told him that he would provide him great wealth if he would curse Israel, because whatever he says comes true. And this prophet could not curse Israel. Israel had God's blessing. And they tried this time and time again until finally he said, if you try and trick them and entrap them, send your women as whores, and make those who lay with them worship gods from your idols, and the God that blesses what I have to say will abandon them. And this is a part of those spirit intoxications where they replace the party's food with the unholy communions and the secret rituals and the infusements and the subtle subversions, allows the taking of what would have been holy Christians and turn them into hell's food, because they accepted to be deceived and were not rigorous studiers and disciplined in the function of the laws of grace from the God who saves, and by their dereliction have found themselves like the virgins who have, in waiting for the celebration of the marriage, wasted all of their oil and had to go to town in order to buy oil. And going into town to buy oil, came back when the celebrations had already started. The husband had already come in and had already shut everything out, and they, being out, are banned from entry, despite having legitimately have been invited. They are no longer welcome in because they were not dedicated in their devotions to specifically being prepared at the time it was necessary for them to be there, fully equipped with their oils and its light. And the systems of the Druids having incorporated the capture of these churches to conduct these ritual changes for the sacrificial functions includes the activities of corrupting them into becoming predatory or Christian nationalists, which materializes the threat against their very soul in favor of being devoured. In Revelation, it says that the one of the churches supports and does not chastise Jezebel, and that it provides to a particular church that it supports the function of sacrificing, uh, eating food that was sacrificed to idols, and the function of these subversions as a subordinate activity of Frazobulu allows for the activity of the prophets from evil and sin, derivative of their pollution from witchcraft, which is the function of secrets and fraud against the courts. And these subversions, such as the voter fraud, which generates the capabilities of the use of secret enforcement tactics against those not guilty of anything in legal reality, but legal manipulation, and the function of customs without reasons having been subverted, that activities allows for the dog whistles, which materializes the subversion, which creates profits, and those profits create food, and those foods have been sacrificed to the idol gods, who have materialized these profits to them from these mechanisms of fraud as tyrannical activities of the government, which has damned souls by its extermination of rights by the tyrant, concerning the normalization of the witchcraft by the hate groups who use these dog whistle policies in order to materialize these extraordinary benefits to themselves.